A severed hand is missing, but its ring has returned. Welcome to Detective Noir. I'm your host, Daniel Mercer. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow. Let's unravel the mystery. It was upon a morning of chalk-grey light and a weary drizzle that the small brass bell of Baker Street announced a visitor, and with it a mood of expectancy which Dr. Watson, who observed all matters concerning his friend with a conscientious attention, could not deny himself. Holmes had been for an hour in one of those trances which often heralded his most remarkable displays, his long figure inclined in the chair like a drawn bow unloosed, his eyes half closed, the profile gaunt against the ashy glow of the hearth. Upon the mantel lay a small cardboard parcel, neatly wrapped in brown paper and tied with a cotton thread so ordinary as to be itself suspicious. It had been delivered not 10 minutes before by a boy whose red hands told of river air and rope work, rather than the errand of a respectable stationer. Watson stood a little apart, the medical journal forgotten in his palm. The wind fussed at the window sash, wheels hissed in the damp street below. All London seemed to be breathing through a muffler. "You perceive," said Holmes without moving, "that our caller will not be an inspector. The left boot squeaks. The right is newly mended, and the rhythm of his foot upon the stair there betrays an anxiety incompatible with the trained imperturbability of a yard man. He will have rehearsed his story, and now mistrusts every word of it." Watson, accustomed by this hour of his life to the swift play of Holmes's mind, glanced in involuntary admiration toward the door. It opened a moment later to admit a gentleman in a rain-darkened ulster and a hat that had suffered the weather without much grace. Nevertheless, his bearing had that air of good breeding which persists in spite of the elements. He could not have been more than 28. He was pale with want of sleep, and he held his gloved hands too tightly, as though to prevent them from betraying him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, and then, seeing the man he sought, took a half-step into the room and halted again as though awed by his own temerity. "Pray come to the fire," said Holmes. "Dr. Watson will take your coat." "The parcel is yours, I think." The stranger's eyes flew to the mantel with a start, which confirmed that delicate wire of conjecture upon which Holmes so often balanced. He removed his ulster with a movement that shook a little at the wrists and would, in another, have suggested dissipation. In him it spoke merely of strain. "I am Lionel Ashbury, sir," he said. "Lord Ashbury, my father, has counselled me to come. It was Lord Holdfast who urged him in turn, who said that the yard is overtaxed and that you are not. I hope you will forgive my abruptness, but the matter is grotesque enough to make any approach ridiculous." Holmes regarded him with that languid kindness which always struck Watson as doubly human in such a man. "The grotesque is a gate through which many a reality enters, Mr. Ashbury," he said. "The parcel, if you please. Tell Dr. Watson briefly how it came into your hands." Ashbury took a breath, steadied himself upon the back of the client's chair, and directed his words to Watson in that stiff manner of a man eager to seem coherent. "It was delivered to my rooms at the Albany less than an hour ago," he said. "The card upon it bears my name, but no direction in the hand with which I am acquainted. The boy who brought it, he would tell me nothing. I gave him a shilling more than he asked, and he vanished. When I opened it," he paused. His throat worked. "When I opened it, I found my ring. The ring I gave Miss Eugenie Carleton last Michaelmas. She has not returned it. She could not have returned it. She has been missing, Mr. Holmes, for 3 days." Holmes's eyes opened fully. The profile relaxed into attention. He did not yet take up the parcel. Instead, he turned ever so slightly in his chair, as a man might ease his limbs before an exertion. "Missing," he repeated. "Speak plainly. When were you last with Miss Carleton?" "On Thursday night at Lady Hargrave's musical. I saw her to her carriage a few minutes before midnight. Yesterday was Saturday. On Friday morning she did not meet my sister for their appointment in Bond Street. By Friday evening my sister had gone to her house in Bayswater and learned from the maid that Miss Carleton had not returned since Thursday. They assumed she had gone to her aunt in Primrose Hill. She had not. Yesterday afternoon we appealed to the police. They advised patience. This morning I found the parcel upon my table, and inside, he reached out as though the object might burn him and faltered before laying his fingers upon the brown paper. Holmes signalled with one long hand that he should proceed. The string was easily loosened, the lid lifted. Upon a bed of cotton there lay a woman's ring, a fine hoop of pale gold with a small oval sapphire set round with minute chips of diamond. Beside it, folded and faintly speckled, lay a handkerchief of lawn, ladies' style. But Watson, who had seen too many of them stained in too many ways, saw at once that these speckles were not of blood. There was a dull greyish smear upon one corner, like coal dust rubbed with a damp finger. Holmes leaned forward at last. He did not touch the ring. His gaze fell first upon the cotton, then upon the paper lining beneath it, then upon the thread that had bound the box. He drew in the smallest breath through his nose, and the hand. Asked Holmes, "The hand?" Mr. Ashbury repeated blankly. "Forgive me," said Holmes without inflection. "It is a vulgar habit of mine to anticipate. You said the ring was yours and that Miss Carleton had not returned it. Could not have returned it." "Pray continue. It returned alone," said Ashbury hoarsely. "There was no letter." Only that." He gestured toward the remaining object in the box, which Watson had at first taken for a scrap of glove. It was indeed glove leather, pale and fine, the kind that fashionable ladies wear for evening, but it had been cut from something larger with an impatient instrument, for its edges were ragged, and across one edge there was a thread of stitching half torn. In the center, faint but discernible, the pressure mark of a ring had impressed the leather, as if the glove had once been worn over it. The ring in the box matched the indentation exactly. Holmes nodded to himself. "You have seen Miss Carleton wear this ring over her glove." "She did so that very night at Lady Hargrave's. She had a habit of slipping it over the glove after taking it off her finger to admire it." "Forgive me, this is intolerable." He pressed the heel of his hand to his brow. "Watson," said Holmes, "you will seat our guest and pour him a little brandy. Mr. Ashbury, you have been practical and admirably prompt. You will be more useful still when calmer. There is no advantage in distress unless it inspires speed." Watson, who had already anticipated the brandy, put the glass into the young man's cold hand. Colour struggled back under the pallor. Holmes rose then in that unhurried fashion which always suggested to Watson a spring that, once bent, would release with decisive force. He took up the ring between thumb and forefinger. His hand was steady as a surgeon's. His eyes in that instant were as keen and impersonal as a microscope's lens. A lady's sapphire, English setting, London work, the claws repaired within the year, he murmured. A trace of beeswax upon the inner hoop, no. Not beeswax, tallow. A candle carelessly handled or a small lamp. And this dust. He touched the grey smear upon the handkerchief with a glass rod. This is not from a hearth. It is from coal that has travelled. Note, Watson, the sheen. This has been crushed and damped and rubbed again. Railway coal, I think, or river wharf. Your boy smelled of tar and hemp, you said. Your handkerchief confirms him. Ashbury stared. There is also the handwriting, continued Holmes, indicating the addressed card that had lain beneath the string. A clerk's attempt at an unremarkable script, but even plainness has its accent. Observe the open loop of the Y in your name, and the slight backward slope of the capitals, the trace of a left-handed man who has schooled himself to write with the right. We shall not make a policeman of him, but we shall find him. Holmes bent the ring to the light, and Watson saw upon the inner hoop a shallow scratch, 2 parallel nicks no longer than the head of a pin, the goldsmith's bench kiss. Holmes observed more to himself than to them. It has been altered. But by whom? And why now? And why now? He set the ring back in its nest, with as much gentleness as if a sleeper might be woken by a clink of metal. He lifted at last the scrap of glove. His nostrils flared again, and a touch of amusement, dry, unilluminated, played at the corner of his mouth, a faint perfume. Not the lady's own, no, an inferior imitation, heavy on orris and lavender, such as one finds in dressing rooms of a certain class of theatre, or in the kits of women who purchase their elegance by the thimble. The glove was cut hastily, and the thread is cheap. Miss Carleton would not have permitted such a repair. So this fragment is not her glove, but belongs to another, someone who wished you to think of her, to think that it is she, cried Ashbury. That she sends back my ring and will not be found? To think what you are intended to think, said Holmes with a half-smile. We shall prefer facts to intentions. There is this also. He pointed to a tiny triangle of paper pasted inside the lid of the box, no larger than a fingernail and browned by age, a remnant of a label. The gum is of a kind used upon private postal labels at smaller firms. The paper is of that pale straw hue one sees from the cheaper stationers in Rotherhithe and Shadwell. The cut runs across a flourish, see, which may have been an S or an L. We shall ask at 4 such establishments between Wapping and Limehouse, and I will wager we shall be served in one of them by a man who writes his capitals backward. But the yard, began Ashbury, helplessly clinging to the familiar ground of authority. Inspector Lestrade promised. He said that if we learned anything, if we waited, we might learn everything when it is too late, Holmes interposed, with that ironical dryness which Watson had seen reduce bluster to obedience. Pray do not mistake me. Lestrade is indefatigable, but he is fettered by forms. We shall be fettered only by our consciences. He glanced at the clock. The drizzle had thickened. The light in the room acquired a submarine cast, through which the fire made an island of colour. You have told us that Miss Carleton vanished after midnight on Thursday, he said. That you appealed to the police on Saturday. That this ring returned to you this morning alone. Let me add one thing to your account, Mr. Ashbury. It did not return alone. No object of this sort travels unaccompanied. It brings with it the company of those who touched it, the ignorant, the sly, the fearful, and the foolhardy. We shall make their acquaintance at the river. At the river, echoed Ashbury. Holmes held the handkerchief once more to the light, and with the nail of his finger flicked at the faintest outline of a dark fleck embedded in the weave. It came loose reluctantly, and fell upon the white saucer which Watson, swiftly anticipating, had set upon the table. Under Holmes's lens it showed itself a minute scale, blackish, iridescent at one angle, as thin as the skin upon warm milk. River paint, Holmes said softly. The skin upon tar when it dries upon old hulls. It flakes thus when rubbed against cotton damp with mist. The boy your messenger stinks of it this morning. Last night he was at the stairs by the water where the lightermen tie their craft. We will begin at Execution Dock stairs and work east. If we are fortunate, we shall be in time to prevent the next act of this drama from being written in a hand more indelible than pencil. The next act, whispered Ashbury. Holmes's gaze went, as it sometimes did, to some middle distance, in which the lines of a plan unrolled like maps. When a ring returns without a hand, Mr. Ashbury, he said, it is either a theatrical gesture or a threat of economy. In the theatre, gesture comes first and action after. Among thieves, action anticipates gesture. In either case, there is a hand somewhere that should wear this ring and does not. Let us endeavour to learn whether it is still attached to its mistress. He took his hat and the old Inverness cape. Watson, who had been at his shoulder in a heartbeat, tugged his gloves on with a sense of impending clarity that came, paradoxically, with darkness. You will remain here. Mr. Ashbury, said Holmes, pausing at the door, send at once to Lord Ashbury that his son is safe with us and that we have begun. If Inspector Lestrade calls, be frank with him. And if anyone, a maid, a boy, a gentleman with ink upon his fingers, asks if the ring has been recovered, you will answer that you know nothing about it. We shall report within the day. Within the day, repeated Ashbury, looking from Holmes to Watson, as a drowning man might look from boat to oar. We shall endeavour. Holmes corrected him, and in that polished evasion there was more resolve than in any promise. He lifted his gaze once more to the parcel on the mantel, now closed and retied. Then he turned to the rain. Watson followed, hearing behind them the soft click of the latch and, beyond it, the strangled hush of a gentleman who waits between two clocks, one in his breast and one upon the wall, neither of which may be made to run faster by will alone. Outside, the street was a blurred ribbon of black and silver, and the air had that briny sting which makes a Londoner think of the river even when he cannot see it. Holmes hailed a cab with 2 fingers and an economy of motion. The driver nodded as at a familiar, and the horse's breath went up like steam in a foundry. They drove east, where the city narrows and then opens again like a hand, toward those stairs where, if Holmes's instincts were not merely instinct, the lost thread of Miss Eugenie Carleton would be picked from the wet weave of London and made, at last, to lead them home. The cab swung east with the desultory steadiness of a barge against the tide, and Holmes, who seldom wasted a yard of silence, used the movement of the trap to marshal his thoughts. He sat forward with the parcel upon his knees, the lid retied but not trusted, and watched the rain stipple the glass as if deciphering a cipher set upon the pane. Watson, reading the angle of his friend's head as he might a pulse, perceived that Holmes was not turning possibilities in the air at random, but fitting them to the hard edges of places which already existed in his mind. Execution. Dock stairs were slick as eel skin and brown with the eternal stain of Thames water. A lighter nosed the steps like a dog scenting a bone it had dropped and half forgotten. The smell there was of tar and wet rope, and the old breath of ships. The sound. The patient clink of chain and the slap of a loose board against a wharf post. Holmes's boots found footholds that Watson's did not, and more than once Watson felt the quick, saving touch of his friend's hand before the river might have claimed him for a clumsy fool. "We will begin where boys loiter and men look away," Holmes said in that level tone which meant he desired to be overheard by half the river and heeded by none. "See the chalk marks on the coping, tally kept by someone who cannot write yet keeps account for all that. And there is our man of ink, though not the right one." The man indicated sat upon an upturned basket, mending a net. Ink had once been a habit with him, for his nails were black in their beds, and the tips of his forefingers had that ingrained stain which is to a clerk what the rope burn is to a sailor. He looked up without curiosity. Holmes's questions were few and exact. Watson lost two of them to a sudden gust that hurled a hand's breadth of river into their faces. Yet the answers, when pieced together, formed a narrow bridge upon which one might pass. A boy of about 12 had been there before dawn, the man said, with a parcel like a hat-box under his arm and a hunger under his cheekbones. He had crossed the planks to a lighter headed toward Blackwall, then returned within the hour by the stairs, empty-handed and with a halfpenny's worth of stale roll in his mouth. He had a way of scratching his left wrist with his right hand, as though a rope had once burned him there and never ceased to itch. He had smelled, the man remembered with that honest attention poor men give to trifles of bad lavender. "Not the river boy, then," murmured Holmes. "A boy who has been lent the river for an errand. Lavender is our theatre again, but cheap." The clerk's hand in the address and the stage's hand in the air. "We must stitch the two." They moved upriver along the wet verge, and there Holmes spoke with a girl who sold winkles from a pail and had beyond question seen every face that morning brought. Her account agreed in the outline, but added a thread. The boy's cap bore a tinfoil pin in the shape of a crown, the sort given out by certain music hall proprietors in place of a proper ticket to those who stood in the gallery and clapped when bidden. She could not name the hall, but pointed inland, with a wry twist of her mouth that included Limehouse in one sweep, and dismissed it with the next. Holmes's eyes lighted and went grave again in the same breath. "Fair crown for the gallery of the Britannia in Hoxton, or the Royal in Whitechapel," he said abstractedly. "But the smell directs us to a smaller booth and the pin to a cheaper show." "No matter. We require before tinsel a strip of straw paper with a backward S. By 11 they had turned from the water into streets that were not quite streets, but the riffled edges of streets, yards full of broken crates, passages in which cats held small parliaments, shops whose windows were not so much displays as apologies. Holmes entered 3 stationers with the indifferent patience of a man choosing gloves, and at each asked for gummed labels and looked, not at what was put before him, but at the hands that offered it. In the second, he found a right-handed child with left-handed ink, a boy forced to copy copperplate with the wrong muscle. The third, a narrow establishment in Shadwell where paper, candles and penny hymn books jostled for honour, yielded more. The proprietor was a slight fellow with eyes that ran before the rest of him. He wrote his capitals with the shy, backward lean Holmes had marked upon the parcel's card. Holmes admired the hymn books, praised the whiteness of the candles, purchased a packet of straw-coloured labels and, while his change was being sounded from a drawer of improbable coins, allowed his glance to skim the paste pot where someone had set the brush, ill-wiped upon the rim. The gum had dried with a faint grey bloom upon it. "Railway dust," he said cheerfully, as though remarking upon the weather. The man started, and then laughed with that strangled heartiness which is the cousin of fear. He swore he had no traffic with the rails. He had, however, a nephew who ran errands when he was not coughing, a nephew who had been out twice since dawn. Holmes did not ask after the cough. He inquired instead after the pin in the shape of a crown. The man's denial came too quickly to be believed, and too clumsily to be useful. Holmes set down his change, picked up the paste-brush, and with the merest touch, pressed its gummy hairs to the card from Ashbury's box. They kissed with the perfect fidelity of old adulteries. "We shall call upon your nephew," said Holmes pleasantly, "and perhaps upon your paste supplier who keeps coal in his gum." The nephew, when fetched, was not 12 but near 14 and had the pin. He had also the sore wrist and the indigent defiance common to boys who have learned that a certain tone will purchase them longer than a certain truth. Holmes paid for information in the currency the boy understood, a sandwich put warm into his palm, and allowed him to lie out the first yard, merely to learn his gait. When the boy's inventions ran short of air, Holmes supplied him with the missing wind in the form of a detail no liar could conjure, the wax thread seam upon the glove scrap, cheapest quality, sold in packets of 6 at a haberdasher's behind a little theatre called the Pomegranate, where perfume is bought by the spoon and applause by the yard. "It was not me as cut it," the boy blurted then, the sandwich sobering him faster than fear. "I was sent, from the back of the pom. A woman give me the box, and a man writ the name. And I was to say naught, which I done. Describe the man," Holmes said, and listened with half an ear as a violinist listens to the room while his fingers take a passage they could play in sleep. "Left-handed by habit," said the boy, because his right wrist had a brace of leather and brass upon it. A clerk's cuff peeped beneath a coat too fine for the quarter, and his hat had a rain mark in the shape of a coin where it had been set, carelessly upon a damp rail. "Enough," Holmes said. "The pomegranate first, Watson. Then a jeweller who alters rings for gentlemen who do not wish to be remembered by their bench." They went out with the boy's crown pin pricking Watson's thoughts, not for its tinsel, but for the hand that had set it upon a cap that morning. The rain had eased to a raw brightness that showed every flaw London had, and made them all honest. Holmes walked with that slight acceleration which Watson had long since recognized as the step of impending demonstration. He had said theatre and Clark and River before they left Baker Street. Now he had, if not the names, the places where names are cheap and therefore easily bought. The hinge upon which the morning turned was small as such hinges always are, a grey bloom upon gum, a crown of tinfoil, a thread of inferior wax. But the door it opened was real enough, and behind it, if Holmes's expression was any guide, stood not merely a stage trick, but the thumbprint of intent pressed deep into the soft gold of a woman's fear. The Pomegranate proved to be as dingy a house as its name was gaudy. It squatted in a back street near Whitechapel, its entrance flanked by 2 columns painted the colour of dried blood, and its bills pasted crooked upon boards that sagged from repeated rains. A hoarse barrel organ played within, and from the side door there drifted the mingled scents of dust, grease paint, and some sweet spirit that clung to the gowns of the girls who laughed too loudly at nothing at all. Holmes paused just short of the threshold, his nostrils taking stock as precisely as his eyes. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "The perfume we traced upon the glove is here in abundance, a concoction retailed to the players at 6pence the vial. Our boy's tale is vindicated in its first note. We entered to a cavernous gloom, its benches peopled sparsely even at this hour by figures who might have been there all night and never left. A painted backdrop of pastoral hills sagged above a stage, upon which 2 apprentices rehearsed a comic quarrel. Holmes paid no heed to them, but moved, light and silent as a shadow, towards the rear where a line of dressing-room doors opened upon a passage rank with powder and damp wood. He tapped one door with the lightest of knuckles. It opened almost at once to reveal a woman of 30, her shoulders bare, her hair pinned high with combs that caught the dim gaslight. "No visitors in the morning," she said tartly, but her eyes altered when they found Holmes. He had that effect upon women of a certain stage world. His self-possession struck them as a form of authority. "Forgive the intrusion, madam," said Holmes with grave courtesy. "We make inquiries regarding a parcel that left this house before dawn. A boy perhaps known to you bore it down river." She hesitated, then laughed with a short, harsh note. "You mean Nell's lad. He runs errands when she can't pay her rent. But you'll not drag me into it. I've enough troubles. We ask only the truth," Holmes said, his gaze never leaving hers. "The parcel contained a ring, madam, which is of great importance. Was it given into the boy's hand here?" Her silence was confirmation enough. She lifted her chin as if daring contradiction. "A gentleman came backstage last night, tall with a brace upon his wrist. He asked for something to be wrapped, said it was a trifle to be sent. Left a crown in the boy's cap. That is all I know. And the lady? Holmes pressed, his voice sharpened to a single chord. Was a lady with him? Only a glove, said the woman flatly, though her eyes flickered. A scrap of it, like you say. He cut it while I watched, with a knife he took from his coat. Said it was for a jest, a prank. I thought him mad. But he paid well enough, and when a man pays well, one does not question. Holmes inclined his head. You have been franker than most would dare. One further question. Which way did he go when he left? By the alley to Bishopsgate, she answered at once, perhaps relieved that the matter was simple. Holmes gave her a half bow, then turned on his heel, his step already quickened. Outside, in the brightness that had followed the rain, his face bore that taut line which Watson knew meant the case had just altered its colour. We must find this gentleman, Watson. The wrist brace marks him as one who has strained a sinew. Clerks do it, so do copyists, and so do men who fence for sport. He cuts a glove in half for no other purpose than to sever an association. A ring upon a glove is a token, and he would see it misinterpreted. And Miss Carleton? Watson asked, struggling to keep pace. Do you believe she is alive? Holmes's eyes narrowed. If she is not, then the charade of returning her ring serves no end but cruelty, which is rare in crime and rarer still when coin is spent to maintain it. No, Watson, she is somewhere, hidden from her world, while another writes her part upon this shabby stage. They reached Bishopsgate and found the press of traffic at its noisiest. Holmes drew them aside into a tobacconist's doorway, and from his pocket produced a scrap of paper. He had traced lightly in pencil the cut of the glove fragment and the dimensions of the ring. With it he compared a mark upon his own cuff, where the fabric had brushed against the ring's setting. The scratch had been fresh. He has altered it, Watson. Not the setting, but the impression it leaves. The bench kiss we saw upon the hoop was recent work. Someone is fashioning a counterfeit, or rather unfashioning a pledge. This is no longer a question of one lady's disappearance. It is the work of a man who would rewrite a bond of betrothal with his own penknife. Watson shivered, though the air was no longer cold. And our next step? Holmes folded the paper with decision. To the jeweller who did the work. There are but 3 within a mile of Mayfair, who would file so neatly and scratch so slightly. One of them has altered this ring within the week, and when we have him we shall have the hand that held the knife. And, God willing, we shall find where they have hidden Miss Eugenie Carleton. Eugenie Carleton. Holmes wasted no words as we hailed a cab and drove north toward Mayfair. The clatter of hooves seemed to pace the thoughts turning within his mind, and I knew better than to interrupt them. At length he spoke, his gaze fixed upon the streaming street ahead. There are scratches, Watson, that tell of carelessness, and scratches that tell of purpose. This one was deliberate. Whoever altered the ring intended it to bear a different story when read. We must find the hand that made it speak falsely. Our first stop was a narrow establishment on Bruton Street. The sign read, Craddock & Sons Goldsmiths, though the shop itself was no larger than a drawing-room. A gentleman of portly frame and careful speech received us. Holmes, with his usual economy, placed the sapphire ring upon the velvet pad and asked if the claws had been touched by their bench. The man lifted his lens, pursed his lips, and declared that no hand of his or his son's would have left so rough a kiss upon the gold. He swore the mark was amateurish. Holmes listened, thanked him, and walked out without so much as a nod. The second house in Conduit Street bore the more reputable name of Fine's. Here the jeweller was lean and taciturn, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the hoop. He admitted that he had altered the claws 3 months ago at the request of a lady, but the new scratch was none of his doing. The file was of another man, one less scrupulous. Holmes drew from him, however, that a clerk had lately visited their premises, inquiring after settings for a sapphire of similar size, though he carried no stone with him. A wrist brace had bound the man's right arm. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Our third destination lay in Maddox Street. The shop front was plain, its window filled with modest silver trinkets, but inside the cases bore workmanship of a finer order. A pale young man, his hair brushed with meticulous care, approached as Holmes again produced the ring. His expression flickered at once. He did not hide recognition. "Yes, sir," he admitted with a faint smile. "I attended to that hoop on Thursday last. A gentleman asked me to smooth a flaw upon the inner band. I filed it lightly, no more. He insisted it be done while he waited." Holmes bent closer. "Describe this gentleman. Tall, sir. A bearing not quite military, yet with a stiffness one does not learn in trade. His wrist was bound in leather. He gave his name, Carlton." The syllable fell like a stone into water. I started, for it was the missing lady's own. Holmes's eyes, however, only grew colder. Did he by chance resemble the lady to whom this ring properly belongs? The jeweller hesitated. "A relation, sir," he said at last. "Perhaps a brother." Holmes straightened. "You did not think to question him?" The young man coloured. He paid handsomely, and he seemed resolved. "Resolved indeed," Holmes muttered as we left the shop. "Watson, the plot is no longer cloudy. It has shape. Miss Eugenie Carlton vanishes on Thursday night. On that same day, a man bearing her name, with a clerk's wrist and a fencer's stiffness, alters the ring that bound her promise. By Saturday morning the ring is sent to her suitor with a scrap of glove and the stink of theatre about it. What does that signify?" I shook my head, bewildered. That some hand, desiring to sever the match, stages her disappearance as if she herself had renounced it. The ring, the glove, the perfume, all point to caprice, even betrayal. But it is too pat, Watson, too neatly told, therefore it is a lie. The cab rolled on through Piccadilly. Holmes sat rigid, his fingers pressed together before his lips. At last he spoke again, low and deliberate. "There is a Carlton brother, is there not?" I recalled then that Eugenie Carlton was not an only child. I had seen her once in society, a graceful young woman, and I vaguely remembered talk of a brother who had run to debt. "Precisely," Holmes said, reading my thought. "Lionel Ashbury is to inherit his father's seat in the Lords. A marriage to Eugenie would tie the Carlton family securely to influence and means. But a brother who sees his sister disposed of without his consent may act rashly, particularly if his own fortune is in jeopardy. The wrist brace, the alteration of the ring, the theatrical trickery, all suggest a man of some education, yet desperate enough to employ shabby means." "Do you think he has harmed her?" I asked. Holmes's eyes were bleak. "If he intended her dead, the river would already have told us so." "No, Watson. She is confined somewhere, hidden until this counterfeit of her will is believed. Our task is to find that prison before the farce is complete." We returned at once to Baker Street. Ashbury was pacing like a caged animal when we entered. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Ashbury, has Miss Carlton a brother?" Ashbury halted, his face paling. "Charles Carlton. He is older by 2 years. But you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely that," Holmes cut him short. "He has shown his hand too plainly. Did you know he altered the ring?" The young man's lips parted in disbelief. "Altered it? But why? To suggest that Eugenie herself had returned it, to destroy your faith in her, to dissolve the match without her voice." Holmes's tone was harsh, though not unkind. "Mr. Ashbury, do you trust me?" "With my life," Ashbury said at once. "Then you will say nothing to the police nor to the Carlton family. Charles must believe his deception intact. I require 1 evening. By morning, if I am right, Miss Eugenie will be restored to you. And if you are wrong?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "Then heaven help her, for we shall be too late." He turned sharply to me. "Watson, bring your revolver. Tonight we call upon Mr. Charles Carlton, and we shall see whether his wrist is braced for writing, or for holding his sister against her will." The evening settled over London with that peculiar thickness of air which seems to weigh upon every street lamp, and it was in that gloom that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in a cab, its windows blurred with mist, as we drove toward the Carlton residence in Bayswater. Holmes sat very straight, his profile sharp against the gaslight that pooled across his cheek, and though he had spoken little since leaving Baker Street, the quick movement of his fingers against his knee betrayed a mind racing with calculation. When at last we alighted before the house, it was with the peculiar sensation of entering hostile territory. The dwelling was handsome, its steps polished, its knocker gleaming, but there lingered about the curtained windows an air of watchfulness, as though the bricks themselves kept secrets. Holmes rang with a firmness that admitted no denial. A servant admitted us, a man whose heavy lids did not disguise his unease. Holmes's tone was curt as he gave his name and demanded to see Mr. Charles Carlton. The man hesitated, but something In Holmes's gaze compelled him, and we were shown into a sombre drawing room, lit only by a single lamp whose shade was drawn low. Moments later, Charles Carlton entered. He was taller than his sister by several inches, broad of shoulder with features that might once have been handsome, but now bore the stamp of dissipation. His hair was carefully arranged, yet his cravat was pulled too tight, and his right wrist indeed bore a wide band of leather that disappeared beneath the cuff of his coat. His eyes, grey and restless, shifted from Holmes to me with the guarded look of a man measuring the odds in a duel. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, the voice modulated yet edged with contempt. "To what do I owe this intrusion?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "To a lady's disappearance, Mr. Carlton, your sister Eugenie." Charles's eyes flickered. Whether from guilt or indignation, I could not tell. "My sister," he said after a pause, "has gone of her own accord. It is not a matter for police or for consultants." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Yet it was you who altered her ring on Thursday, was it not? You who sent it, with a glove fragment and a false perfume, to Mr. Ashbury to convince him she had renounced him." The man's composure faltered, his jaw clenched. "You presume too much." "I presume nothing," Holmes said, his voice cutting the silence like a blade. "I have the testimony of the jeweler who filed the band while you waited. I have the stationer who supplied the labels for your parcel. I have the boy who carried it from the Pomegranate Theatre to the river. All threads bind together, Mr. Carlton, and they weave a web that entangles you most cruelly." Carlton's hand, the unbound one, tightened upon the back of a chair. "You dare accuse me of harming my sister?" Holmes's tone was iron. "I accuse you of concealing her." "Where is she?" The man's breath caught. For a moment he seemed about to strike Holmes, then he mastered himself with an effort that left his face pale. "She is safe," he said at last, each word dragged out as if from a wound. "Safer than she would be shackled to Ashbury, whose father's debts lie deeper than mine. "Ashbury's debts?" I exclaimed, astonished. Holmes lifted a hand for silence. "The truth is rarely so simple, Watson." Carlton's gaze turned fierce. "You know nothing of it." "My sister's fortune, her dowry, it is all that remains to keep our name from ruin. Ashbury seeks it, nothing more. If she wed him, she would be lost." Holmes regarded him with that cold detachment which never failed to unnerve. "Your concern is touching but false. If protection were your object, you would speak openly, not disfigure her honor with this charade. Where is she, Mr. Carlton?" Carlton's lips pressed into a line. "I will not tell you." Holmes's hand dipped into his coat and produced the ring, gleaming faintly under the low lamp. He set it upon the table between them. "Then know this, Mr. Carlton. Before dawn I will have found her. If she is harmed, if so much as a hair upon her head is mislaid, this ring will be the chain that drags you to the gallows." For an instant the man's composure cracked, and I glimpsed the desperation beneath, the kind of desperation that drives men into folly. Yet he recovered himself and gave a short, bitter laugh. "Search if you will find nothing." Holmes rose at once. "Then good evening." We left him there, rigid by the lamp, his eyes following us like those of a hunted animal. Outside, the night air struck chill upon my face, and I shivered. Holmes hailed another cab, his voice brisk. "We have him, Watson. His guilt is certain, but the proof lies still hidden. He has told us more than he intended. Did you mark his words? She is safe. It is not a boast of a killer, but of a jailer. She is confined somewhere within his reach, yet beyond his walls. A house near enough for him to visit, discreet enough to avoid suspicion. And you know where?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Not yet." But he betrayed his hand when he spoke of Ashbury's debts. That lie was too clumsy. He invented it to excuse his own designs. "We must look for the place where his money has gone, where rent is paid not for his comfort but for her confinement." He tapped the roof of the cab. "To Somerset House, Watson, at once. Property records will tell us what Charles Carlton owns or leases. By midnight we shall know the prison in which Eugenie waits, and if she does not wait, Holmes?" I asked quietly. "Then, my dear fellow, his protest of safety will prove the blackest falsehood of all, and we must prepare ourselves to uncover a crime far darker than abduction." The cab rattled on into the fog-bound night, and the weight of Holmes's words pressed upon me like the damp mist itself. Thickening with every yard we drove toward discovery, Somerset House loomed vast and silent when we arrived, its facade washed pale by the lamps along the Strand. The hour was late, yet Holmes carried himself with the composure of a man for whom time itself bends when necessity demands. He passed swiftly through the corridor of clerks and watchmen, with that air of quiet authority which seems to unbar every door. Before long he had the ledgers before him, thick tomes in which London's endless web of property and inheritance was inscribed with pitiless exactitude. Holmes bent over the pages with the absorption of a scholar. His fingers skimmed the columns until at last they halted. Carlton Charles Henry, 2 entries, the family house in Bayswater, already known to us, and another, a small property leased in his own name situated on the eastern fringe of Kensington near Cromwell Crescent. The lease had been renewed only a fortnight past. Holmes closed the ledger with a decisive snap. There is our prison, Watson, a discreet house in a quiet quarter, close enough for him to visit under cover of darkness. The lease renewed, proof that he intends to keep it. We must go there at once. We hailed a cab without delay and drove west, the lamps dwindling into the kind of silence peculiar to London after midnight, when even the omnipresent rumble of wheels gives way to the occasional hoofbeat, echoing like a metronome across deserted squares. Holmes said little, but I could see from the keen glitter of his eyes that his mind was now fixed upon a single point. The house upon Cromwell Crescent was unremarkable, a narrow, 3-story dwelling with a shuttered front and no light within. Yet something about its very blankness betrayed occupation. Holmes studied it in silence from across the street, then touched my arm. Note the guttering at the roof. It is new, though the rest of the house is long in need of paint. And the curtains, purchased in haste of common cotton, though the rent of this quarter suggests tenants of better taste. It is a mask, Watson, and like all masks it slips if one looks too long. We approached the door. Holmes examined the lock by lantern light. A recent scratch upon the brass told of hurried use. He produced a slender tool from his pocket, and in a moment the catch yielded. We entered upon a narrow hall that smelled faintly of coal dust and stale perfume, the same orris and lavender that had clung to the glove. Holmes closed the door softly behind us. The house was silent save for the faintest creak overhead. We ascended, Holmes moving with such precision of step that the boards scarcely groaned beneath him. At the landing he raised a hand, listening. Then, from behind a locked door, there came the unmistakable rustle of movement. A chair shifted, a soft gasp quickly stifled. Holmes bent to the lock. Within seconds it opened, and we stepped into a small chamber dimly lit by a single candle. Upon a narrow bed sat Miss Eugenie Carlton. Her gown was rumpled, her face pale, but her eyes, wide with fear, brightened at the sight of us. "Dr. Watson," she whispered, as if scarcely trusting her own voice. "And Mr. Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You are safe, madam, but we must be swift. Is your brother in the house?" Her lips trembled. "He comes and goes. He left me food this evening. He said it was for my own good, that I was to be spared an unhappy fate." Holmes's eyes hardened. "He has spared you nothing but liberty. Come, we must leave before he returns." She rose unsteadily. I offered my arm, and she leaned upon it with a gratitude that cut me to the heart. Holmes extinguished the candle and guided us back through the darkened stair with uncanny surety. When at last we reached the street, the cold air struck her cheeks, and she seemed to breathe for the first time in days. We were but halfway to the waiting cab when a figure emerged from the shadow of a garden wall. Charles Carlton stepped into the lamplight, his face contorted by a mixture of fury and despair. "You!" he cried hoarsely, his gaze fixed upon Holmes. "You would steal her from me?" Holmes placed himself calmly between brother and sister. "You mistake the matter, Mr. Carlton. It is you who would steal her freedom." Charles's hand moved toward his coat, and for an instant I feared he carried a weapon. Instinctively I reached for my revolver, but Holmes's voice cut through the tension, low and commanding. "Think well before you act, sir. The law already follows you by a dozen threads. To add violence would be to tighten the noose. Stand aside, and you may yet plead that your motive was misguided affection. Resist, and you condemn yourself outright." For a moment the man trembled as though upon the brink of ruin. Then with a broken cry he sank against the wall, covering his face with his hands. "Take her then," he muttered. "She was all I had." Holmes did not answer. He led Eugenie swiftly to the cab, ushered her inside, and bade the driver take us directly to Lord Ashbury's residence. As we drove, She clutched my hand with a silent desperation that spoke more eloquently than words. Holmes, seated opposite, regarded her with a gentleness that belied his usual detachment. "Courage, Miss Carleton. The night has been long, but the dawn will clear it. Your brother's folly is grave, yet not beyond the redemption of truth. You are safe now, and soon Mr. Ashbury shall know it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I could not speak, overcome by the mingling of relief and anger at the cruelty she had endured. Holmes leaned back at last, the faintest sigh escaping him, as though the relentless tension of the chase had at last eased. Yet I knew well that his mind was already arranging the sequence of facts he would lay before us come morning, when all threads must be drawn together and the final knot tied. The cab carried us swiftly through the sleeping city, its wheels drumming a steady beat upon the cobbles, as though time itself pressed us onward. Miss Carleton sat between Holmes and myself, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the shifting lamps beyond the glass. She had scarcely spoken since we drew her from that narrow prison, but every breath she took now seemed an effort at freedom. Holmes, though outwardly composed, kept his eyes upon her with a scrutiny gentler than his usual manner. At last she broke the silence in a low voice, almost as though she feared to awaken the very streets. "Mr. Holmes, why has Charles done this? What possible end could such cruelty serve?" Holmes leaned forward, the light catching the angles of his face. "Not cruelty, madam, though the result is cruel enough. Desperation. Your brother is entangled in debts that weigh heavier than his pride allows him to confess. He sought to prevent your marriage, not from care for your heart, but from fear of what it would cost him. In his blindness, he imagined that by staging your desertion, he might preserve both his fortune and his control." Her lips trembled, yet she held her head high. "He told me Ashbury was ruined, that I would be sold to a man drowning in obligations. Holmes's tone softened, but it lost none of its clarity. "Falsehood, Miss Carleton. Lionel Ashbury is no beggar. His family's difficulties are temporary, and do not touch his honor. Your brother sought to poison your trust, so that you would not resist his scheme." She closed her eyes briefly as though steadying herself against the truth, and then whispered, "I knew in my heart it was a lie." "Yet he is my brother. Family bonds," said Holmes quietly, "may excuse affection, but never deception." We drew up before Lord Ashbury's residence in Mayfair as dawn began to stir the horizon with pale strokes of light. A servant, roused in haste, ushered us in, and in a moment Lionel Ashbury himself appeared, dishevelled from a sleepless night. At sight of Miss Carleton, he uttered her name in a voice so raw with relief that even Holmes looked away for an instant, unwilling to intrude upon such naked feeling. She went to him at once, her composure breaking, and he folded her into his arms with the fervour of a man who has nearly lost the world. Holmes allowed the moment to pass, then addressed Ashbury with grave brevity. "Miss Carleton is safe, but her brother's plot has nearly undone you both. He must answer for it. I advise that we summon Inspector Lestrade without delay, lest Charles attempt to flee." Ashbury nodded, though his gaze never left Eugenie's face. "Do what you must, Mr. Holmes, only thank you." Holmes inclined his head, but I saw that his expression remained troubled. When Lestrade arrived an hour later, brisk and officious, Holmes laid the matter before him with such precision that even the inspector, so often sceptical, found little room to quibble. The ring, the glove, the perfume, the jeweller's testimony, the theatre girl, the boy's errand, all were woven into a chain of evidence that bound Charles Carleton beyond denial. Lestrade, though clearly irked at being shown the way once more, could not conceal his satisfaction at so neat a case. He departed at once with 2 constables to secure the man, yet Holmes did not rest. As we sat with coffee in Ashbury's drawing-room, he paced the carpet with that restless energy which betrayed some unquiet in his reasoning. "Watson," he said suddenly, "does it not strike you as odd that Charles should go to such lengths, weaving such elaborate misdirection, when a simpler lie might have served? A word whispered here, a forged letter there, yet instead he contrived this grotesque theatre." I considered. "To make the severance more convincing." Holmes shook his head. "No, to draw attention away. The ring, the glove, the perfume, they are baubles, Watson, set before our eyes like the conjurer's handkerchief. The true question is not why he wished to end the engagement, but what he sought to conceal while we chased these trifles." Miss Carleton, who had regained a measure of composure, looked up anxiously. "Conceal? But he told me plainly it was to prevent my marriage. Holmes turned to her with that grave courtesy which never failed to command trust. He told you what would serve his purpose, madam. Yet in his attempt to deceive Ashbury, he deceived me as well for a time. Now I see that a greater matter lies beneath. Your brother's debts are real, but they are not enough to drive him to such extremes. No, there is another hand or another stake that urged him on. Ashbury, still holding Eugenie's hand, frowned. Another stake? Holmes stopped pacing and faced us, his eyes alight with the sharp fire that always heralded revelation. Consider, Watson, the alteration to the ring. Why file it at all? It did not strengthen the claws or change the stone. It erased something, a mark perhaps, or an inscription, something that, if seen, would have betrayed the true mover in this plot. Charles did the work, but for whose benefit? A silence fell. I felt the weight of the puzzle pressing upon us, its edges sharp, but its center still veiled. At last I said, "Then you believe Charles is not the sole architect?" "Precisely. He is an instrument, not the composer. His clumsiness betrays him, but the hand that guided him remains unseen. And until we discover that hand, Miss Carleton is not yet free from danger." Eugenie's face paled and Ashbury's grasp tightened upon hers. Holmes moved to the window and drew aside the curtain. The light of dawn spilled into the room, grey and chill, illuminating his profile like a carving in stone. "This case," he said softly, "is not finished. Charles Carleton will answer for his part, but we must look beyond him. There is a deeper game, Watson, and the board has only just been set." He let the curtain fall, and in that dim half-light, I saw the shadow of unease in his expression, a rare admission that even for Holmes, the next move was uncertain. The hours that followed were heavy with waiting. Lestrade returned by mid-morning, his expression one of official triumph, though tinged with the irritation he could never quite conceal when forced to acknowledge Holmes's precedence. Charles Carleton had been taken at his Bayswater residence, protesting loudly of his innocence, but unable to deny the evidences laid before him. He was now lodged in custody at Bow Street. Lestrade declared the case neatly concluded, the culprit secured, and congratulated himself with a flourish that might have convinced anyone but Holmes. My friend listened to his recital, with eyes half-lidded, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and when the inspector at last departed, Holmes let out a sound midway between a sigh and a growl. "The tree is felled, Watson, but the roots remain. Charles Carleton is guilty of much. Falsehood, abduction, forgery perhaps, but not of the whole. I ventured that his actions alone seemed desperate enough to warrant all we had seen." Yet Holmes shook his head. "Reflect upon the ring. Why erase a mark from its inner band? Charles gained nothing by it. He meant only to persuade Ashbury that the ring had been returned by Eugenie herself. The filing was not his idea. He carried out another's bidding." Miss Carleton, pale from her ordeal yet resolute, rose from the settee. "Then who?" she asked quietly. "Who else would wish to destroy my happiness?" Holmes regarded her for a long moment. "Tell me, madam, who besides your brother had frequent access to your jewels?" She thought, brow furrowed. "Only my maid, Alice. She has been with me for 2 years. I trust her as I would my own hand." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Trust is the coin most often counterfeited. This, Alice, has she any acquaintance with your brother?" "Not that I have seen," Eugenie replied, though her voice faltered. "Yet she has gone these 3 days. We assumed she followed me when I disappeared." Holmes turned to Ashbury. "Mr. Ashbury, if you would permit Dr. Watson to remain with Miss Carleton, I must pay a call upon this vanished maid. The trail that Charles opened has not yet led us to its end." I accompanied him, for despite his suggestion, I could not let him face the matter alone. We returned first to the Carleton house in Bayswater, where the staff, cowed by scandal, were ready enough to speak. Alice had not been seen since Thursday evening. A cab had fetched her with a single trunk, and she had given no word of her destination. Holmes examined her chamber with minute attention. Within 10 minutes he had discovered beneath the lining of a drawer a crumpled receipt from a pawnbroker in Clerkenwell, dated but a week earlier. The item pawned was a brooch of turquoise and pearl. He held it up to me with quiet satisfaction. The servant who pawns a mistress's trinket seldom limits herself to trinkets. This, Alice, is no innocent, Watson. She is the channel through which Charles was guided. The hand that moved her also moved him. We hastened to Clerkenwell, and at the pawnbroker's we found our suspicions confirmed. Alice had indeed pawned several articles, all minor, all belonging to Miss Carleton, but the broker added with a sly smile that the girl had lately come into better favour, for she was seen in the company of a gentleman who paid her account and reclaimed one or two of the pledges. The description was precise, tall, stiff in bearing, with a brace upon his wrist. Holmes's eyes gleamed. So Charles himself paid her way, yet not for her sake alone. She was the go-between, rewarded to keep silence. But why the erasure upon the ring? Unless the inscription told a story inconvenient to their scheme. We pressed the broker further, and at last he recalled that the ring itself had been shown to him in passing, though never pawned. He remembered it distinctly because of a faint engraving within, the letters E.A. entwined with L.A. Holmes nodded grimly. Exactly so. It bore the mark of Eugenie and Lionel Ashbury, a private betrothal seal, perhaps, cut upon the hoop at the time of their understanding. To erase that was to erase the promise itself, leaving only a trinket any woman might discard. The deduction chilled me. Then the scheme was not merely to dissolve their match, but to obliterate all proof that such a bond had ever existed. Holmes's reply was grave. And such obliteration serves not Charles, who has neither wit nor foresight enough, but another who would profit more directly. The question is, who gains if Eugenie's pledge to Ashbury is denied? As we left the pawnbroker's, Holmes was silent, his mind whirring like the cogs of a great machine. At length, as we entered the cab, he spoke in a tone low and decisive. "There is one whose name we have not yet spoken, Watson, though it hangs over the affair like a shadow. Lord Holdfast. Lord Holdfast." I started. Holdfast, the peer who had advised Lord Ashbury to seek Holmes's help. Just so, Holmes said. He is of an age to covet new alliances, his estates pressed by debts whispered of in every club. He would see Eugenie's fortune bound elsewhere, to his own son or nephew perhaps. It was he who pressed Ashbury's father to involve me, knowing that if I failed or seemed to, Ashbury's claim would collapse entirely. Observe the cunning. Charles and the maid are pawns. The true player sits higher. The carriage rattled westward once more. Holmes's eyes shone with the light of imminent revelation. We must return to Ashbury's house without delay. If I am correct, Lord Holdfast himself will call there before nightfall to console, to advise, to weave his net anew. And when he does, Watson, we shall be waiting. He drew the curtain aside, and through the grey veil of London's afternoon I saw his reflection in the glass, sharp, austere, inexorable, as though the city itself had become a board upon which he moved his pieces, already anticipating the final checkmate. When we returned to Ashbury's house, the air within seemed charged, as though every ticking of the clock drew us closer to some hidden culmination. Miss Carleton had regained colour, though the strain upon her features was still plain, and Ashbury hovered near her like a man who fears to wake from a fragile dream. Holmes greeted them with the briefest assurance of progress, then paced the room with his hands clasped behind him, listening less to their words than to the rhythm of the world outside. He halted more than once at the window, peering down into the street as though he expected the very bricks to yield their secrets. At length he spoke in that cool tone that made my nerves taut. "Mr. Ashbury, has Lord Holdfast called upon you since your fiancée's disappearance?" Ashbury frowned. "Indeed he has. Twice, in fact. He offered sympathy, but, if I may confess, I found his manner peculiar. He urged me not to despair, yet his every word suggested the match was ill-fated from the start." Holmes inclined his head, satisfied. "The serpent shows its coil even while speaking comfort. I expect we shall see him again today. When he comes, I beg you and Miss Carleton to betray nothing of our suspicions. Leave the matter to me." Miss Carleton looked anxious, but she nodded with quiet courage. Ashbury agreed readily, though his jaw set with impatience. The hours wore on. Holmes's restlessness increased, and I could see in him that peculiar tension I had observed in other cases, the calm before a storm of deduction. At last, as dusk began to fall, the knock of the knocker echoed through the house. A servant entered with a card upon a tray. Holmes's eyes flickered as he read it aloud. "The Right Honourable Lord Holdfast." "He is punctual," Holmes murmured, as though the appointment had been arranged by clockwork. "Pray, show him in." The nobleman who entered was a man of some 60 years, tall and still erect, with a hawk's profile and eyes that seemed too alert for one who claimed only to console. His attire was immaculate, yet the faintest impatience clung to his movements, as if he bore within him a matter of urgency he struggled to disguise. He bowed to Miss Carleton, pressed Ashbury's hand with ostentatious warmth, and settled into the offered chair with the air of one accustomed to command. "My dear friends," he began, "how relieved I am to see you reunited. Yet I fear your ordeal has shown us all the fragility of earthly ties. Such entanglements, however well meant, may bring only sorrow when pursued against prudence." Ashbury stiffened, but Holmes's warning glance silenced him. Holmes himself drew closer, his tone courteous yet edged with steel. "Your lordship speaks with the weight of experience. Yet tell me, what prudence is it that urges a brother to betray his sister, a maid to pawn her mistress's jewels, and a ring to be filed until its very promise is erased?" Holdfast's eyes narrowed. "I do not follow you, sir." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Then allow me to guide you." The ring bore an inscription, initials entwined, binding Miss Carleton to Mr. Ashbury. That bond was too dangerous for your designs, and so it was effaced. Charles Carleton was the instrument, but you, Lord Holdfast, were the hand that moved him. The nobleman rose, colour mounting in his cheeks. "This is intolerable. Do you accuse me, sir, of conspiracy?" Holmes's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I accuse you of plotting to dissolve a betrothal by fraud, of bribing a servant to aid you, of corrupting a brother's weakness to your end. The motive is plain. Your estates are imperilled, your heir in need of fortune, and Miss Carleton's dowry the only purse rich enough to mend your house." A silence fell so deep I heard the crackle of the fire as though it were thunder. Holdfast's hand trembled upon the chair-back, and for a moment I thought he would strike Holmes. Instead, he sank back into the seat, his breath quick and shallow. "You are bold, sir. Yet what proof have you?" Holmes withdrew from his pocket the crumpled pawnbroker's receipt and laid it upon the table. "Proof enough that the servant was in your pay, for Charles Carleton has no means to redeem trinkets at such a cost. The money came through your hand, and when Charles altered the ring, he did so at your insistence, for he had no reason to destroy what tied his sister to Ashbury. You alone stood to gain." Holdfast's eyes darted from face to face. Miss Carleton shrank against Ashbury, whose expression darkened with fury. At last the peer spoke, his voice hoarse. "And if all this were true, would you drag a noble house through the mire for the sake of a boy's infatuation?" Ashbury sprang to his feet, but Holmes intervened, raising his hand. "Not infatuation, my lord, honour. You sought to purchase freedom with deceit, but truth is not a coin to be spent so cheaply." Holdfast's composure broke. He leaned forward, his hands clenched. "Yes, I used Charles. Yes, I pressed the girl into service. What choice had I? Ruin stands at my gates, and my family cannot endure it. She would have been safe, and Ashbury rid of her before scandal struck. It was mercy, sir, mercy." Holmes's eyes were cold as steel. "Mercy does not bind with ropes, nor silence with falsehood. You may plead your ruin, my lord, but the law will call it fraud." The door opened then, and Inspector Lestrade entered with 2 constables, as Holmes had contrived earlier. At sight of Holdfast they paused, uncertain, but Holmes spoke with authority. "Take this man into custody. He will answer at Bow Street for conspiracy and coercion." Holdfast made no resistance. He rose slowly, his dignity collapsing like a garment too heavy for his shoulders, and allowed the constables to lead him away. The door closed upon him, and a hush fell. Ashbury turned to Holmes, gratitude struggling with astonishment. "How could you be so certain he would betray himself?" Holmes permitted himself the faintest smile. "When a man arranges puppets, Watson, he cannot resist pulling the strings too tightly." His every word betrayed the anxiety of a hand that feared discovery. I merely laid the stage, and he performed his part. Miss Carleton, tears in her eyes, grasped Holmes's hand. "I owe you my freedom, and more than that, my faith." Holmes bowed slightly, his face composed, though I caught in his eyes a glimmer of something softer. "Guard that faith well, madam. It has been dearly bought." The clock struck the hour, and with it I felt the weight of the case at last lift, though Holmes's expression remained thoughtful, as if the echo of deception lingered still in the corners of the room. The house seemed curiously hushed after Holdfast was led away, as though the walls themselves recoiled from what they had witnessed. Ashbury remained standing, his hand still clenched in indignation, while Miss Carleton sat with her gaze lowered, pale but steady. Holmes, ever the master of the moment, moved calmly to the hearth where he stood with his back to the fire, his long figure outlined in flame. The light flickered across his features, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar brightness which always followed the unmasking of a design, yet beneath it, a glimmer of fatigue that betrayed how closely he had bent his mind upon the case. Ashbury was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Holmes, you have saved Eugenie and unmasked a villain. Yet I cannot comprehend how a peer of the realm would stoop to such devices." Holmes regarded him with his thin smile. "Pride, my dear sir, is a more desperate creditor than any banker. Holdfast's house is old, his fortune waning. He could not endure the thought of its collapse. To him, Miss Carleton's dowry was not merely wealth, it was survival. When pride starves, it grows cunning." Miss Carleton raised her head then, her voice tremulous but resolute. "And my brother. What will become of him?" Holmes's expression grew grave. "Charles will stand beside Holdfast in the dock, though his guilt is of a different shade. He is weak, easily led, and he allowed himself to become the instrument of another man's ambition. The law will measure the difference. Yet if your testimony is merciful, Miss Carleton, it may temper justice with pity. Justice with pity." She pressed her handkerchief to her lips, and Ashbury took her hand gently in his own. I could not but admire the courage with which she bore the weight of betrayal by her own blood. Holmes, however, was not yet finished. He crossed to the small table where the ring still lay, its sapphire gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He lifted it, turning it between his fingers with an air almost meditative. "Observe, Watson, how a simple circle of gold became the axis upon which this affair revolved. A promise engraved and then erased became the fulcrum of deceit. Had I not traced that alteration, the rest might have remained forever in shadow." I leaned closer. "And yet, Holmes, had you not discerned Holdfast's hidden hand, Charles's guilt might have sufficed for all just so," he said, slipping the ring back into its box. "Which is why I never accept a conclusion until every thread is knotted. A half-solved puzzle is but an invitation to error." At that moment Lestrade returned, his manner brisk but touched with the deference success in Holmes's company always forced upon him. "Holdfast is secure," he reported. "The evidence you placed before me will serve well enough, though I confess I had not suspected the nobleman until you laid it bare." Holmes inclined his head. "The yard will have its triumph, Inspector, and deservedly so. Yet remember, a tree with rot in its roots may bear green leaves until the last. Watch Holdfast's affairs closely, lest other debts or allies surface to obscure the case." Lestrade muttered his agreement, then withdrew, leaving us once more in quiet company. Ashbury turned to Holmes with gratitude unfeigned. "You have restored to me not only the woman I love, but the honor of our bond. How can I ever thank you?" Holmes waved a long hand dismissively. "Thanks are but words, Mr. Ashbury. Guard Miss Carleton's trust more jealously than her jewels, and you will have paid me more than coin could measure." Eugenie's eyes shone as she spoke softly. "I shall never forget, Mr. Holmes. You have given me back my freedom when I feared it lost forever. For the first time in many hours." Holmes's expression softened, and he inclined his head with a gentleness rare in him. "I ask only that you wear your ring once more, Miss Carleton. Let no hand but your own decide when it shall be set aside." She accepted the box with trembling fingers, her gratitude too deep for words. Ashbury pressed her hand, and in their shared silence there was more eloquence than speech. Later, as we returned to Baker Street, through the damp chill of early morning, I could not resist breaking the quiet. "Holmes," I said, "there is still something that puzzles me. You spoke of deeper games, of unseen hands. Do you believe we have uncovered the whole?" He leaned back against the seat, his eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "Enough for now, Watson. The puppet master has been exposed, and the players dispersed. Yet London is a vast stage, and there are always other strings waiting to be pulled. And the ring?" I asked. Holmes opened his eyes and regarded me with that piercing look which seemed to see through stone. "The ring is but a symbol, my dear fellow. It bound a promise, it bore an erasure, and in the end it returned without a hand. But now once more it rests where it belongs. That is the nearest to justice we mortals may hope to achieve." The cab rattled on, the gas lamps flickering past like silent witnesses, and I reflected that in all the strange cases I had shared with Sherlock Holmes, none had shown more clearly how fragile is the line between trust and betrayal. By the time we reached Baker Street, Holmes had already sunk into that profound silence which no question could disturb, his mind retreating to its own citadel, leaving me to marvel at the man whose brilliance could turn even a broken ring into the key that unlocked a labyrinth of deceit. So ended the matter of the ring that returned without a hand. Yet as I set down the tale now, I cannot help but feel that the shadow of Lord Holdfast's ambition lingers still in some quiet chamber of memory, a reminder that beneath the glitter of society lies the same darkness that creeps through alley and dock, waiting only for the keen eye of Sherlock Holmes to unmask it. The days that followed passed with a swiftness that belied the turbulence they contained. News of Lord Holdfast's arrest spread through the clubs and drawing rooms of London with the relish society reserves for scandal, while Charles Carlton, pale and broken, languished in custody. The trial, when it came, was brief. Holdfast's influence could not withstand the weight of Holmes's evidence, the pawnbroker's receipt, the jeweller's testimony, the servant's betrayal, all converged to lay bare his conspiracy. Charles, though condemned for his part, received the mercy Holmes had predicted. It was clear he had been a pawn, though a willing one. He was spared the severest penalty, and whispers suggested exile rather than ruin might await him. For Ashbury and Miss Carlton, however, the storm broke into clear skies. Their engagement was formally renewed, this time in the open sight of both families, and with a ring that bore its inscription untouched. I was present when Eugénie, with tears that were not of fear but of joy, slipped it back upon her finger. Ashbury's gratitude to Holmes was deep and sincere, though Holmes himself would only remark that he had merely dusted the glass through which others might see more clearly. One evening, not long after, I found Holmes in his chair at Baker Street, the smoke of his pipe curling lazily into the dim lamplight. The case notes lay upon the table, his long fingers tapping once upon the final page before he closed it. He looked up at me with that faint, ironic smile that so often masked the full measure of his satisfaction. "You see, Watson," he said, "how the smallest flaw may betray the grandest scheme. A scratch upon a ring, a smear of perfume, a pawn trinket. Trifles, perhaps, but trifles are the grains of sand upon which conspiracies stumble. Holdfast might have succeeded had he not insisted upon effacing the mark of a promise. Pride undid him as surely as any rope. And yet, Holmes, I said, I cannot but feel pity for Charles." Holmes's expression grew grave. "Pity, yes. But remember, Watson, weakness may be as dangerous as malice when it lends itself to darker designs. The law will judge him, but time may yet temper the verdict." He rose then, casting the closed file upon the pile of past adventures. Another case concluded, another shadow dispersed. And yet, mark me well, there will always be other shadows. I watched him as he turned back to the fire, his profile lit by its glow, and felt again that curious blend of awe and affection which never failed to overtake me in such moments. The world might not know how close it had come to losing one innocent woman to pride and greed, nor how a single ring had nearly been stripped of its meaning. But I knew, and I knew too that whatever darkness yet lingered in the alleys and parlours of London, so long as Sherlock Holmes kept watch, no deception, however subtle, could long endure. So ends the account of the ring that returned without a hand, and of the cunning that sought to sever bonds by fraud. For it was, in the end, not the cruelty of violence but the arrogance of pride that was unmasked, and once more I was left in silent admiration of the man whose mind could pierce such veils. Holmes, for his part, only reached for his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and filled the room with a melody as intricate and inevitable as the chain of reasoning that had restored truth to its rightful place.